Now, our economic outlook, as you guys know, has kind of been traditionally a later in the spring event, but we've decided to move it up to earlier in the year because this is front of mind for everybody, right? What is the economy going to look like? And what should we be aware of, thinking about, and ready for both personally and professionally, for our businesses and our personal lives? So our goal is to help you get a better understanding of that. We've put together some great speakers that hopefully provide you some insight. That said, we have some phenomenal speakers, a little bit different than our traditional speakers that we've had in the past. We've traditionally had a bank economist from the national level come down and give us some insight. Last year we had a great panel from Frost Bank join us and talk a little bit about the economy here. This year we are blessed to have a senior economist from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas join us here to give insights both on a macro and micro level here in Central Texas, and the United States. Then we'll hear a little bit about our local economy and what we're experiencing here and what we anticipate seeing in 2023. Then we'll go into an interactive discussion with a couple banking partners and their perspectives, both again at a macro, regional, and local level. But that said, I want to thank all of our speakers and our sponsors today. To start, first off, Frost Bank. John, thank you again for that sponsorship, as well as Texas Regional Bank. Thank you guys for both sponsoring and being two of our speakers today and our speaker sponsors. In addition, we have Benchmark Insurance, Doucette Associates, Kimley Horn, and Texas State University, all tremendous partners, and thank you again for supporting this event today. As well as all of you, our table sponsors and all of our attendees. Tremendous to have all of you here engaged in this conversation and participating. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank all of our local elected officials. If you are an elected official, please stand for 1 second, if we could, just to recognize you. I saw at least the Mayor Houston is here. Who else we have here? Commissioner Terrio, thank you. Thank you. Mayor Watts, thank you very much. Lee, thank you very much. Thank you guys again for being here and participating in this event. So with that said, I want to, if I could, also recognize, before I forget here, our chairman of our board, Mr. Scott Burton, is about to take a bite. Scott, thank you very much for your leadership and chairing our board this year in 2023. So with that said, I want to introduce Roberto. Roberto Coronado is our speaker today from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. He is our vice president in charge and senior economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, San Antonio, and the El Paso branches. He provides regional input into the Dallas Fed's monetary policy process and is responsible for monitoring and tracking economic business activity in West, Central, and South Texas, as well as Southern New Mexico. We are really excited, Roberto, to hear your comments and welcome you to the stage.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with all of you, and thank you for having us. I'd like to introduce one of my colleagues from our office in San Antonio, Judy O'Malley, who's sitting here at the front. So if there's anything that we can do for you and your organization, either Judy and I will be more than happy to start a conversation with you after today's program. But I want to thank the Greater San Marcos Partnership for the invitation to be here today. We had a wonderful opportunity to had a dinner last night with some of the board members and some of the business leaders from the San Marcos region, and appreciate that conversation very much. Jason, thank you for your patience. I don't know if you recall, but we talked about doing this about 18 months ago, and we are finally here, so appreciate the patience and the invitation. So today I would like to talk a little bit about the U.S. and the Texas economy and give you a little bit of a glimpse of what we expect to see in 2023. I don't think I have to tell anyone that it is very hard for an economist to have a perfect crystal ball and see how the economy is going to evolve. And in today's environment, it's even more difficult and more challenging. So I come to you with lots of humility that, what I'm about to say, we'll see how the year unfolds. I think the last 2 or 3 years have taught us that there's a lot of things that we simply do not know that will happen and certainly take the economy in a different direction. But if I lose you throughout the next 20-25 minutes, the punchline of the presentation is, the economic outlook for both Texas and the U.S. continues to weaken, and this is despite job growth and despite inflation slowing down. So we expect the economy to slow down both for the U.S. and Texas, and I'll show you lots of charts, more than you wanted to see, and we'll make sure that you have those available in the coming days. So let me see. So the overview of the remarks are, as I said, the U.S. and the Texas economy, as they both closed 2022, we saw slower growth particularly in the fourth quarter and even into the third quarter of last year. And the slowdown, it's broad-based. There are some sectors that continue to do well, but for the most part, we've seen a broad-based slowdown when you looked into output, revenues, employment, new orders, indicators, housing, construction, and even some of the leading indexes for both the U.S. and Texas continues to suggest a slowdown into 23. The good news is that price and wage pressures have eased and continue to ease in the last few readings, although they both remain pretty elevated, and that's been a big source of pain points for business leaders and operators. And then the outlook continues to suggest, as I mentioned before, perhaps slower growth in 23. There are plenty of risks to both the U.S. and the Texas economy. Top of mind for us, of course, are the Russia-Ukraine war and the implications that they may have for all sorts of commodities and energy and other sectors in the economy, in the global economy, as well as the challenge that we continue to face as far as elevated inflation and, of course, the rising interest rates and what sort of impact would those have for different sectors of the economy. So let me just spend a little bit of time talking to you about how Texas and the U.S. Weathered during the pandemic. And I think this chart illustrates, particularly the two bars to the far left, illustrate how both economies have performed. This is looking at employment growth since February 2020, the onset of the pandemic, through the last reading we have, which could be either November or December, depending on whether you're looking at Texas or the U.S. Bottom line is that both have recovered all of the jobs lost during the pandemic, but you can see how Texas has clearly outperformed, and this is a recurring theme throughout the last 20, 30 years, that Texas tends to outperform the U.S. economy by a wide margin, and the last 24 to 36 months has not been the exception. Texas has about a little bit over 4% more jobs than those that we had back in February of 2020. The U.S. Less than 1% more. When you looked at the blue bars, pretty much across the board, with the exception of one or two sectors, we've seen all of the sectors recovered nicely after the pandemic, and that is not the case for the U.S. economy. There are still some sectors in the U.S. economy who have not been able to go back to pre-COVID employment levels. When you take a snapshot into some of the metro areas in the state of Texas, Jason alluded to at the beginning of his remarks that this is the part of the Texas economy to be in. This is the sector, or the region, I'm sorry. And you can see how Austin has done. And by Austin, this is the metropolitan statistical area, which includes San Marcos, and has done extraordinarily well and seen a lot of growth and employment growth and growth in general in the magnitude of almost 11% in this same time frame. When you looked into population and migration dynamics across the U.S., Texas and a few other states have been very strong magnets of people moving into Texas. So it's people and businesses. And when you looked and compare how have migration flows changed in light of the pandemic, and the data that we have suggests that Texas saw a significant flow of people moving into the state, and that accelerated post-pandemic in the magnitude of perhaps 50 to 70% more people have moved into Texas post-pandemic than pre-pandemic. And there are two regions in the state that have attracted most people, is the DFW region and the Austin region. And you can see here, by just those numbers, when you see that Dallas and Fort Worth growing at 7.3 and 4% and Austin 11%, clearly suggests that this is a part of the state in which has been very attractive for people moving in. Where are they moving from? And you know this better than I do because it's probably your neighbors, right? And your co-workers. predominantly from the coastal areas, California, New York, and then we've seen a lot of folks from the Illinois, the Chicago region moving into Texas and into this part of the world. Now, looking into more recent economic performance indicators, this is GDP growth for the U.S. economy. You know, GDP is the broadest measure of economic activity we have. And the first half of 22, we saw 2 consecutive quarters of decline in GDP growth. And then we saw a strong third quarter. GDP grew about 3.2% for the U.S. economy. And then the other set of bars in here is just dissecting where did the growth come from? And the punchline in here is that the growth came from consumption. And consumers, you and I represent 2/3 of the U.S. economy. But consumption has been particularly strong in the service side of the economy. We saw a weakness in the goods side of the economy throughout this year, and we've seen how the consumption of goods has contracted or remained flat. But on the service side of the economy, we have not seen that. And I'll show you another picture here in a moment to talk about that dichotomy that exists between goods and services. The other point worth noting here is housing, which is the bars more or less in the middle, which is residential investment. As interest rates began to increase in 22, one of the sectors that is the most sensitive to interest rate hikes is the housing sector. And we began to see a significant decline in contraction in housing across the nation. And that you can see how housing is actually having negative contributions to GDP growth. And the largest of it was in the third quarter, which won reducing GDP growth by close to 1.5% of GDP, percentage points of GDP growth. I'll show you a chart on housing and how that's panning out in the state of Texas in a moment. This chart breaks down consumption into goods and services. Goods is in blue, services is in red, the overall consumption level is in black. As the pandemic hit, and if you recall, if my household was a representative household, we saw a lot of boxes showing up at the front door, and we hardly had any haircuts in the early stages of the pandemic. And you can see how both goods and services with a significant contraction of consumption, and as we start venturing out, as vaccines became more widely available, as therapeutics became more widely available, and people start moving into the economy, we saw that services slowly but surely has been catching up with overall trend. Services still below overall trend, what you would expect to see, but pretty much caught up there. And then if you look into the last portion, the far right of the chart, you see the blue line pretty much moving sideways and in some cases contracting. And that's what I meant, that when we looked into goods consumption, we haven't seen some softening there. But services, we have not seen that. People and business, professional services, and services in general, consumer services, continue to do really well in the last few readings that we have. More timely economic indicators in the U.S. economy is the Institute for Supply Management. These are monthly indicators. Whether you look into manufacturing or services, particularly the leading indicators, there are new orders, continue to suggest that the economy is slowing down in recent readings. Looking into job market, I mentioned before that Texas typically outperforms the U.S., and in here the blue bars represent job growth in the state of Texas back to 2012. The red line represents job growth in the U.S. economy. Roughly speaking, rounding numbers up, Texas grows roughly around 2.2% per year. The U.S. economy around 1%, so we outperforms by about 1 percentage point on a historical basis. And you can see that in 21, we actually outperformed the U.S. economy. 22, we've seen a slowdown in job growth, still positive, still 3.5%. But we are coming closer to what we are observing in the U.S. economy. Looking into year-to-date job growth, both Texas and the U.S., and you see a lot of similarities. When I show you from February 20 to today, you see a big difference between Texas and the U.S. If you look into 22 alone, which is where this chart is showing up, you see a lot of similarities, and basically Texas moving and converging to U.S. growth rates last year. When we looked into the unemployment rates, pretty low unemployment rates. Texas sitting around 4%, the U.S. about 3.7%. The Austin metropolitan area, I think it's about 2.8, 2.9%, which is extremely, extremely tight labor markets. Of course, in the middle of the pandemic, we saw very unemployment rates shooting through the roof, but slowly but surely they've come down, and they continue to be pretty tight. I mean, we often forget how tight the labor market was in January of 2020, and we're pretty much where we were there back then. We've seen wage continue to grow, both for Texas and the U.S. If I were to drop the line for Austin, it would be on top of the U.S. So job growth and job levels in the Austin region, which includes San Marcos, it's a little bit higher than what we see in the national economy. But the bottom line is that job growth continues to grow, continues to be present, and we've seen some softening in Texas, but not something significant. One of the biggest challenges the U.S. economy and Texas is facing is high inflation. Inflation is simply too much high. And this chart shows three different levels of inflation. We have here personal consumption expenditures, both the headline number, which is in blue, and the core number, which is removing energy and food in in green. And those, as you can see, are in the 6 and 5% range. The Federal Open Market Committee, they've set a target of 2%. So clearly suggesting that we are way above the target, and this is why the Fed has been particularly aggressive in 22, raising interest rates to try to bring inflation back into check. It's encouraging to see that the last few readings are moving in the right direction, but I think it's too early to call victory because we still need to bring those numbers down to the 2%. And so the good news is moving in the right direction, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done ahead of us to anchor the inflation back into the 2% and bring price stability. There's a third line there, which is the red line, is the trim mean PCE. This is an indicator that we produce out of the Dallas Fed, and what we basically do in there is we trim the goods and services that grow the most, the goods and services that decline the most, and we just keep the 80% medium range. And even if you look into that indicator, it continues to suggest that it's very elevated, sitting around 4.7%. I mentioned to you that we're seeing and we're hearing, and last night when we talked to business leaders, we're beginning to see some of the softening. Now, it's harder in this part of the country because of all the growth that you are seeing, but you're still getting to see some of the signs of slowing. This chart shows the residential housing sector. And in here in green, you have interest rates. I think this is the 30-year mortgage rate. And I think everyone's aware that has grow extremely rapidly in 22 because of the Fed policy and raising interest rates, sitting around 7%. And then you see both home sales in blue and permits in red. And as soon as interest rates start moving up, you start seeing some of the softening in the housing market. Like I mentioned at the beginning, housing sector is probably one of the most sensitive sectors in the economy with respect to interest rate hikes. And we're beginning we've seen that for most of 22 as far as the housing sector is concerned. And by the way, these numbers are for the state of Texas. We have at the Dallas Fed, and if you are in the manufacturing sector or the services sector, we would love to count with your input, and if you can help us through our service. So we have two main surveys for manufacturing and services, and we produce this, or we conduct this on a monthly basis. This has been a phenomenal tool for us to really have a deep understanding of economic conditions across the state of Texas. And in here we have from the manufacturing survey, production levels in blue and then new orders in orange. And you can see how in the middle of 22, we start beginning to see the softening in the manufacturing sector in the U.S. economy. We are not alone. Other reserve banks conduct similar surveys across the nation. And in here you have surveys from New York, Philadelphia, Richmond, the Kansas City Fed, and then a national survey. And depending on which Federal Reserve district you looked into it, most of the manufacturing surveys are indicating and pointing to a softening in the manufacturing sector. What we're also learning from business contacts like yourselves through our service is that the cost and wage pressures are easing, although they continue to remain fairly elevated. And here you can see how in 21 they start seeing a substantial increase, and then eventually in the second half of 22 beginning to retrench a little bit. Price pressures are also moderating. This is selling prices both for manufacturing and service companies in the state of Texas, but again, continue to remain elevated. Something that we've been hearing as recently, and by recently I mean maybe in the last 2 or 3 months, is that unlike in the first half and even in 21 and the first half of 22, businesses had quote unquote a relatively easy job of passing through higher prices to customers. Well, businesses are telling us it's not as easy today as it was before, particularly for small businesses. They are the ones who are struggling the most, passing higher costs to customers. And now we're beginning to hear medium-sized companies having some of those challenges. So it's becoming a little bit more problematic for businesses to pass through. And that, of course, is going to could have potential implications for profit margins and then for the overall well-being of businesses in the state of Texas. So this is something we're tracking really closely and trying to understand better what are the dynamics underneath these trends. Now, what about the outlook? So like I mentioned, the labor markets are slowing. Manufacturing output has pretty much softening substantially. The service sector revenue continues to be in the positive territory, but we're beginning to see some softening there as well. Price and wage pressures have weakened, but they remain elevated. And for last year, we still don't have numbers through the end of the year. So we expect or we anticipate that we would close the year in 22 with growing at about 3.2%. The number that I show you is 3.5%. So we expect the incoming data for the end of the year to come a little bit weaker and close the year at 3.2%. And this is the evolution of our forecast for 22. When we started the year, we were at 3%. As the year progressed, we became a little bit more bullish on the Texas economy. And then once we hit the summer, early fall, we start to see the signs of weakening in the national economy and in Texas, and we begin to revise down our forecast for the Texas economy. Now, looking into the U.S. economy in here, there's a couple of benchmarks as far as outlooks or forecasts for the U.S. economy, looking into GDP, unemployment, and inflation. The first column is for the blue chip. This is a survey of professional forecasters from across the country, and this is just the average of their forecast. And on the right-hand column is the FOMC. So the Federal Open Market Committee participants, there are 19 participants, are required to submit their projections every quarter, and then we publish those. So this is the so-called dot plot charts that you've heard in the media. But then they also produce forecasts for, again, GDP, unemployment, and inflation. And the right column is the last forecast that the FOMC participants have submitted, which is from their December 22 FOMC meeting. If you look at this forecast, clearly for 23, the expectation is that the U.S. economy will grow around 0.5 percentage point, which is still, a slowing of what we've seen in the second half of 22. The expectation is that the unemployment rate is going to go up probably and close the year maybe in the 4.6% in 23 and maybe 4.6% in 24 based on the most current forecast. Inflation, the expectation is that inflation is going to continue to trend downward and maybe close the year in the 3.5% in 23 and then get closer to the 2% target by 24. The FOMC is expecting 2.5% inflation by the end of 24. So if I can summarize, I know they are getting ready for the next portion of the program. I haven't talked too much about the energy sector for the state of Texas. The energy sector is traditionally a strong tailwind for the state of Texas. We haven't seen much of that in 22, and we don't expect to see much of that in 23. The energy sector has seen some softening for a number of reasons, so we don't expect the energy sector to provide a lot of tailwind to the Texas economy. Then we also anticipate, like I mentioned, slowing down in both the U.S. and Texas. Price pressures are likely to continue to be there and remain elevated into 23. And if the FOMC and the central bank decides to tighten monetary policy more in 23, this is likely going to have implications for the outlook for the U.S. economy and, of course, for Texas. Just want to thank you again for your time. There's, if you're interested, so every year we host an event at the Dallas Fed, which is our Texas Economic Outlook. We produce a formal forecast for employment growth for the state of Texas. I gave you a little bit of a preview of what you'd expect to hear, but the official forecast from the Dallas Fed is not coming until February the 3rd. This is going to be an event that we're going to be hosting in our Dallas office, but it's also going to give you the opportunity to join virtually. Here is the information on the event. We'll make sure you have access to it. I think the registrations go live on Monday of next week. So if you're interested in getting a more detailed analysis of what the forecast would be, the official forecast for the Dallas Fed for 2023, I'll ask you to please stay tuned and give us a few more weeks so that we can crunch all of the data and get all of our modeling done and ready. And hopefully you'll be able to join us. There's plenty of resources on our website at thedallasfed.org, not only in the Texas economy, but different regions. We have Austin economic indicators. We have a lot of analysis on the technology industry. We have a lot of analysis on energy sector, housing sector. So depending on which side of the economy you are in, more than likely there's something in there for you. So I would invite you and encourage you to visit our website. And this is a list of the resources. There is, I think we put in your seats as you walk into the room, we put an evaluation form for you. If you're so kind and have spent a minute or two and fill it out for us, this information is very valuable to us. There's an opportunity, I believe, in the evaluation form. If you want to be part of those Outlook surveys that I show you and the indicators, if you want to participate, I think there's a box you can check, and one of our team members is going to follow up with you and talk to you a little bit more about that and see if they are interested in helping us out with your input. But again, I just want to say thank you for your time. Jason and the Greater San Marcos Partnership, thank you for the invitation. Hope you enjoyed the rest of the program.
All right. Roberto, thank you again for those comments and those insights. We appreciate it a ton. And let me just fix that mic up here. And then, so hearing that and hearing a little bit of what is to come, I want to share a little bit more perspective here locally to color a little bit of that for you guys and potentially give you a little bit more optimism looking into 23. Just because, right, that stuff was a little bit challenging to hear after so many good years of positive growth, but certainly it's a reality, right, and we have to be prepared for it. So to start, I want to level set everybody, and many of you have heard this, but some of you may not. In September of 2022, the partnership finished its fiscal year with its third consecutive record year, virtually breaking every record the organization has ever set. Really, what it means is providing our communities more jobs, more investment, more tax revenue, more tax base, more people, and all the things that make this place such a vibrant and amazing place to live. That said, fiscal year 23 started for us in October, and sharing November for us was a record month. We actually had more requests for information on new projects come in the month of November than any month in our entire history. So it's amazing to hear the backdrop of what we just heard with the reality of what we're experiencing in economic development. What I mean when I say that is we're 3 months into our fiscal year, and those first 2 months represented $75 billion of new capital that was interested in this Central Texas region. What that means, that equates to more than 20,000 new jobs that could potentially be infused into our economy. These numbers represent more than 50% of our entire pipeline that we had at the end of last fiscal year. That, as I mentioned, was a record-setting year. So what is driving this growth? I want to share a little bit of some data at the really micro level here to give you guys a deeper dive and a little bit more into the understanding of the narrative and what it is we're experiencing and how it relates to the backdrop that Roberto articulated so well. As he mentioned, the census just released that the state of Texas has officially surpassed 30 million residents, a trend that we don't expect to slow down at all into the future. You guys have all heard the numbers. Our neighbors to our north and south are expected to double their populations over the next 20 years. Fun fact, we also were named for the second year in a row the #1 state for inbound U-Haul transactions. Something that, again, shows that not only the number's true, they're happening at record levels. And these new residents are finding Texas, but really they're finding Central Texas, and quite honestly, they're finding the innovation corridor and where we sit as the epicenter of that growth. You guys have heard Hays and Comal County, just to our south, are both in the top 10 in the country and remain in that stead as the fastest population growth numbers. The innovation corridor, the area here we view in between Austin and San Antonio, has experienced 3.8% annual growth rate, faster than our neighbors in Travis County at 2.6 and Bexar County to our south at 1.6. The national average, as you saw, of 0.6, we're surpassing that and surpassing the Austin MSA at 3%. Individually, Hays County grew at 4.3% in the past year and Caldwell County at 1.4%. Both still above the national average. And as you guys know, and you've heard us talk about many times, workforce is the #1 decision when it relates to companies looking to find a new location for their operation. And with all those population growth numbers, we sit well poised to continue to see this growth into the future. But let me pull out a little bit and talk a little bit about Texas. In 2022, Texas recovered all of its jobs lost in the pandemic, as Roberto had mentioned, bringing our new job total to a historic high of 13.6 million as of October 2022, following 13 consecutive months of job growth. We've ranked #1 in exports for the 20th consecutive year, valuing our exports at more than $375 billion. In 2022, Texas became the #1 state in the country for the number of Fortune 500 headquarters located within any state at 53. And only going to increase when you look at the information we're experiencing here in Texas. We've been named to our 10th annual Governor's Cup, an award that's provided to the state with the most corporate relocation and expansion projects from Site Selection Magazine. This is the 18th Cup for Texas and 10th in a row. We were named last year the State of the Decade for Economic Development. Texas is ranked the 9th largest economy among nations of the world. Think about that in perspective, larger than Canada, Korea, Russia, and the country of Australia. A huge economy. And as Roberto mentioned, we are blessed to be sitting in the epicenter of all of that growth. The job recovery rate since the pandemic has been 148%, and the gross domestic product in Texas grew 8.2% in the third quarter of 2022, up from an annualized rate of 1.8 in the second quarter, according to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. Our numbers, adjusted for inflation, put Texas second among all states, only behind Alaska in our U.S. growth rate of 3.2%. Important not only in Texas, but pulling down a little bit deeper into wages. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce's Bureau of Economic Analysis, earnings increased across the country, as you guys all experienced and have heard, and as businesses had to absorb in some form or fashion. It grew at a national rate of 6.7%. But in Texas, we grew even bigger, as we do in everything, exceeding the rest of the country at 8.5% change. And Hays County in particular grew at 8.7% in 2022, not only beating the national average, but second only to Galveston County in the state of Texas, putting us squarely in the top 20 around the entire country, which for us is important to highlight because in economic development, one of our core principles is to increase wealth and increase opportunity for the folks that live in this region. So yes, there were outside pressures, but also bringing those new jobs and opportunity to make the quality of life better for the residents had partly to do with it. And our neighbors in Caldwell County and partners also grew significantly at 6%, just slightly below the national average. When it comes to jobs, in the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Texas Workforce Commission, at 5.1%, Texas has the fastest annual job growth rate in the entire country, with 657,000 jobs added in 2022 alone. And they created more jobs than any other part of the country. Here in our region, in Hays and Caldwell County, we brought an estimated 7,600 new jobs in 2022. And in the last fiscal year, to give you some perspective of that, the partnership and the projects we worked on alongside our regional partners added 2,500 new jobs and 9 new companies into this community coming into the future. Thank you. Even more so on that, looking back, just going back a couple of years and looking at from the just before the pandemic in 2020, we've had more than 30 companies decide to relocate or expand into this 2-county footprint representing nearly 5,000 new jobs that will come online into this region in the coming years, and more than $2.5 billion of investment here to this region. Excited because this is important. When we see downturns, this is why we do economic development, to help us weather these storms and bring these opportunities online. Per our partners over here at Workforce Solutions Rural Capital, the unemployment rate in Hays County is 2.9%, in Caldwell, 3.3%. Both still lower than the national average, as we saw earlier, and lower than our state unemployment rate. The Department of Labor estimates our labor force participation at very high levels. We're at 79.5% here in Hays County and 70.7% in Caldwell. Both are well above that national average of 62.1% and even above our state at 63.5%. So we do have the labor force that's active, willing, and wants to be part of the equation. In addition, I want to share some of the GSMP stats that help augment what we just talked about. We do an annual impact study every year. Hopefully you guys get to see that. Our annual impact that we provide into our two-county footprint, and this is on an annualized basis, is a $5 billion contribution year over year into the two-county footprint. In the last fiscal year alone, we helped generate an additional $284 million in new property tax revenue and sales tax revenue into our local communities, helping making sure the services we need, the school systems, and the services provided are there for our elected officials. Over the last 16 months, this activity has continued to surge. We've seen and experienced roughly 25% of all of our indirect job creation and direct job creation, alongside 65% of all of the capital investment brought into the partnership throughout its history, happen in just those last 16 months. So as much as we know there is a little bit of cloud on the horizon, we think we're extremely well positioned to walk into 2023 in a position of strength and a position of opportunity. When I look at it through the lens of economic development, all this means to us is competition will be more fierce. Projects will be far and fewer between, which means we need to be really well prepared, as I know we are, and many of you that help us, almost everyone in this room has helped us in some form or fashion land these projects, need to be ready and prepared to tackle those projects, attract those projects, welcome those new jobs into our region and to our residents. So we're excited for it, and we do think we are in the best position in the country to attract it, and excited to take you now a little bit deeper with a few speakers that are going to join me here on stage. So as we do that, I want to thank, first off, Frost Bank and Texas Regional Bank for sponsoring the program. We're blessed to have two of their great employees joining us here on stage. So first, can I have Mr. Alan Edelman, Senior Fund Manager and Senior Research Analyst with Frost Bank. As Alan walks up, Alan joined Frost Investment Advisories in 2019 and has over 30 years of investment experience. His primary responsibility is to the advisors of equity strategies, where he manages stock selection, sector allocation, and portfolio construction. Of his 30 years of experience, 25 include senior leadership roles for global financial leaders, including Chief Investment Officer for First Interstate Bank of California, First Union Bank, and Wells Fargo Offshore Trust Company. Alan, thank you for joining us on stage. Next, I'd like to welcome Mr. Lincoln Talbert, Chief Financial Officer for Texas Regional Bank. Lincoln is a Velasco native who joined the bank in 2015 as Senior Vice President and Market President. He began his banking career in 2001 at Texas State Bank as a first Vice President. In 2010, Lincoln took his talents to an oil and gas company as Chief Financial Officer. He now serves as Chief Financial Officer for the Texas Regional Bank and is responsible for the management of the bank's finance function, including asset liability management, pricing, bond investment portfolio. And all I have to say is you've been very busy. So great job with the bank. With that, I also want to mention to everybody in the audience, I encourage you to participate in this conversation. We did not script any questions, so I will tell you we're going to talk a little bit on some topics, hopefully that are of interest to all of you, and then we would encourage your questions. So up on the board here, you see the QR code, but also the website and the code to use to enter those questions. I'm going to grab an iPad here in a second, and we'll get those questions live time sent up to me. So by all means, please participate, join in the conversation, and I'm going to slide back and start our panel. slide that out of the way, and I'll switch you guys.
Gave me cover.
All right, as they're taking away the podium there, I will start. And Alan, I'm going to go down to you to start. Maybe if you can just share with us macro view of what you think is going to happen in 23, both at the maybe start nationally, take us into Texas, and as much as you can, maybe comment a little bit on what you think is going to happen here in this region.
No, Jason, happy to do so. Thank you for the invitation. This is awesome. So, as you folks know, I am part of Frost Bank, and Frost is very focused on the Texas marketplace and Texas economy. And I'll start off by saying two things. First is the part of the role that I play is more national or global with Frost. Frost is very local in Texas, but we invest money for clients like yourselves, institutions, others across capital markets. So this is where my comments are coming from. So having said that, starting with Roberto, who is just fabulous, our expectation is, yes, we are heading into a economic slowdown nationally, and that will trickle down to Texas. Are we going to do better nationally? Yes. But what I would say is that we're going to have more adverse times, and through adversity comes opportunity. So our overall perspective is that nationally we expect us to perhaps get into a mild, not deep, mild recession or flatline, not having economic growth from an overall perspective. And we see inflation remaining stubbornly high. There is not a client that we talk to in Texas that when we say, how's business going, either the first or the second comment is, we're having difficulty in hiring qualified people. And that's everybody. So that provides a headwind relative to the overall economy. And I'd rather be in between San Antonio and Austin and the corridor here. You guys are just in a great position. But even with that, you know, reality is that you're already having problems in hiring people. I'm quite certain of that. But you're incredibly well positioned. So Jason asked me to prepare some notes, so I'm going to make this quick. But in terms of an overall outlook, Roberto mentioned that the consumer is responsible for 2/3 of the overall economy. Now, not everybody here is in the consumer business, but it all impacts you. So our view is that the consumer at large, they may have had the last hurrah over this last Christmas season, but our sense is the consumer is exhausted, fatigued, and this period of post-pandemic spending is going to be behind us. So the consumer's going to slow down. Plus, purchasing power, you know, we all are facing pricing power in terms of our wages, take inflation. So pricing power as it relates to wages is becoming more difficult. So you may be earning a decent wage, but inflation is high, and what does that mean for your overall spending power? So that's going to be diminished. And that also impacts real disposable income. And, you know, from our perspective, we're definitely heading into a tightening cycle. So interest rates are going up, as Roberto had mentioned, and we think that impacts not necessarily the top 1%, but the lower quintiles of the economy in terms of earning power, and that may not impact you directly, but that impacts the state of Texas and everybody at large. We think that this is shaping up to be one of the most well-advertised recessions in the history of the economy. So I like to be a little bit of a tweaker in terms of if everybody's saying one thing, I like to think another. But everyone's expecting a recession, and we don't think it's going to be that bad. And we think that there's opportunities in the corridor, but we think that there's opportunities nationally for investing. Credit standards, Lincoln will probably touch on this as well, but credit standards are tightening for the consumer and for businesses. And I'm not suggesting anything here, but if your business model is predicated on low interest rates and easy money, that's not necessarily a sustainable business model in the coming environment. We think, and Roberto had to leave to catch an airplane, so I can say this without having him stare at me. But the Fed has moved more aggressively now than any time in the most recent past. So they've increased interest rates by 4.5%. That's faster than any other, any other period that we can recall. So it's taken its impact, but we would also suggest to you that we look at the Fed increasing interest rates in their February meeting by another 50 basis points. We could be off by a few. We don't think we're going to be low. We may be a little bit high, but 50 basis points in February and another 25 in March. And then they'll exhale and hold their breath. We don't think that they're going to decrease interest rates anytime this year. I mean, I wish they would, but we don't see that as a happening. Perhaps in the first half of next year, and at the same time, we see in the first half of 2024, we see a resurgence in the economy. So that's our general story, and we're sticking to it and happy to get more specifics.
Alan, thank you. Excellent. You hit on several topics I know we'll dive into a little bit more, but Lincoln, as a regional bank and a community bank here, maybe take us down a notch into your perspectives on what you see.
Okay, well, I think I would agree with everything Alan said, and I think while I would agree with Alan and most of the economists I read, and I'm not an economist by trade at all, is that the recession, albeit whether it's really a recession, we can all argue that. I think the challenge for business people going forward and entrepreneurs and everybody in this room, it's the velocity of the change and the change from where we were with what Jason described, especially in this corridor. Y'all have seen meteoric growth. Our Hill Country team, who's sitting here at the table, has reminded us on numerous occasions, fastest growing MSA in the country, sometimes I think in the world. But it's the velocity of the change, and it's similar to what we've experienced at the bank, and it's the velocity of the interest rate change. I mean, this is the highest percentage increase relative to where rates started to where they went ever, pretty much.
Yes.
And digesting that is a real challenge. And I think the other piece to the story is, and Roberto touched on it, the consumer is 2/3 of the economy. Whether you are purely commercial, we're a commercial bank, but every customer that we bank at some point relies on a consumer. And if you look at, while, yes, savings surged during the pandemic because there was an unprecedented amount of fiscal stimulus put into the economy. I think the stat was money market deposits in commercial banks in that period of time frame from 2020 to 2021 grew from $15 trillion to $18 trillion. That means the cash supply in banks, in consumers' pockets, able to spend, increased 20% in a very short period of time, and that was spent. But fast forward to now, you look at the levels of consumer debt climbing at unprecedented levels. Credit card debt is getting back to pre-pandemic levels. And we're starting to see delinquencies happen too. And the unfortunate part about this, and this is where the inflation, I think, really is a quiet killer of economic productivity, is that spending has been going to supplement the increase in price to a lifestyle people became accustomed to during the pandemic with all of the stimulus coming through. That's going to run out, and that is going to start to slow things down. in the largest sector of the economy, which is the consumer economy. And you're starting to see that in other statistics. The savings rate dropped below 2.5% at the last reading, where it was up over 20 during the pandemic. So a lot of the money that was saved by consumers is already flooding out the door. Now, the other thing we're seeing at the banking level, and Alan hit on this with the top earners. The top earners, they're not feeling this, right? If you're in the upper echelon of you know, the income status cycle, those sorts of things, you know, yeah, you complain about $4 gas, but you still put it in your gas tank. You know, that person living paycheck to paycheck, you know, they have to make the decision, do I go to work or do I go get my nails done or do I go get my hair cut and those sorts of things. And I think that is where you'll start to see things flood into the economy and really see the slowdown. But I would agree with Alan. I don't think we're going to see a deep recession like you saw with the great financial crisis, anything like that, but I do see a slowdown. The other piece I wanted to touch on is what he touched on is credit is going to be tougher to come by because of the velocity of rates have gone up and everybody has sticker shock on their interest rates now. You know, I can remember since 2020 to probably, March of 2022 before they started rising rates, you know, and as Jason mentioned, I'm in charge of pricing and sometimes I'm the guy they love the most, but most time they really don't like what I have to say. And Lincoln, what do you mean I have to charge 4% for a loan? I gotta be in the threes. And well, I'm sorry, I mean, we've got to make money as a bank. Well, you should hear it now when I say, guys, that project is a 9% project. It's the market. You know, you look at, we're in the business of pricing risk, and we have a market that tells us where our starting point is, and then we adjust accordingly for risk. Well, the market, in the riskless market, has increased over 450 basis points. So you're already starting at 7.5 Wall Street Journal Prime. Then you add on top of that slowing economic factors that increases risk and diminishing liquidity at banks too, and adds a liquidity premium to it. So I think it's that sticker shock that might give an investor a pause, that might lead to a slowdown, but you know, I don't think it's going to be as bad as what, you know, CNBC or Fox News or whatever channel you watch says it's going to be, but it is going to be a slowdown. And because we're coming off of such of a high, it's going to feel like it's really bad, I think.
No, very helpful. And again, hitting on some points, let's take a deeper dive in a minute. I want to, Lincoln, stay with you for a second and talk to us a little bit about this region and things you see as advantages, but also disadvantages. And if you can, sprinkle a little bit, I think, into the post-pandemic world, accepting the reality that it is different than it was just a couple of years ago. And then after you comment, Alan, take us up the national side and give us perspective on Lincoln's comments as it relates to what you anticipate nationally and how our region might play a role in the larger national economy.
So, you know, admittedly, I don't live in this region per se. I live in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas, but we have a large footprint here, and so we stay involved in the economy here. And, you know, the number one factor that we talk about that I think is the whole state, but particularly this area here, and Roberto touched on it, is positive, what do you call it, interstate migration. You know, I think at one point, y'all had something like 173 people a day moving to the Austin MSA. And there again, I think that is the number one factor that keeps this local economy going, because people spend money, they bring money, they buy houses, they've got to buy groceries and those sorts of things. And to speak to the velocity, you know, it's like, you know, I know there's some people out there in the real estate market and those sorts of things. And I think there's a little bit of a shock because you're back to counting days in markets in days, not in hours or minutes like it was before. And so, but I think that's the number one strength. I think for the state of Texas, our bank we were founded along the border in the Rio Grande Valley, and so we have a great appreciation for our Mexico business partners. And Texas and Mexico has always been a great partnership between the two. And I think what's not as widely published is the world's coming to an end, Jerome Powell's going to wreck everything, is the positive impact that the supply chain disruption had on Mexico. Mexico is doing very well since the end of the pandemic. I think, what was the word you used, nearshoring? Yes. Friendshoring. The amount of companies that have moved production headquarters to Mexico is astounding. I think it's well over 70. And, and that is bleeding up through Texas. You look in the Rio Grande Valley region, cold storage, warehouse storage along the international bridge corridors are one of the hottest commodities you can find, and that is filtering up through the state. So I think while nationally and on the macroeconomic level we'll see that, we definitely have some nice attributes that are benefits from post-pandemic on what we experience that'll kind of help rise the tide for our local economies through this tough time.
I agree, and I can underscore, Lincoln, your comments just from anecdotes from the partnership and the amount of companies that expressed having a new location in Mexico that now want a secondary location to either finish product or move it along into the greater United States via their location. So, Alan, please share your thoughts there.
Well, so let me just take what Link said and put it forth in a more global context. So when the pandemic hit, what happened? What happened was that we recognized that buying chips and getting parts put together in Asia and other locales wasn't quite as effective or efficient as it was earlier in the decade. And I think that one of the benefits that we had with globalization was we had a very, very low rate of inflation for a lot of years, largely a result of the fact that we could manufacture stuff in countries that had a much lower cost of production and then ship them here to the United States, and whether you assemble them here at the Toyota plant in San Antonio or other places. Well, that game has changed dramatically. It's not over yet, but it's changed dramatically as a result of the pandemic. So we went from globalization now to a focus more on onshoring, bringing production back here to the United States, or friendshoring, where we go to Mexico, Canada, other countries that we can rely upon that are close, that will basically allow us to improve the supply chain. Supply chains are greatly improving, but this phenomenon of globalization, it's changing. And so I think bringing it into your community, I think you're going to benefit from it. It may not be tomorrow, but I think that we've talked a lot about the consumer and things that might be somewhat more local in nature, or wages, or hiring people. But I think you folks are in just a fabulous position because your business is global. It's not just here in the corridor. It's everywhere. So from our perspective, that there'll be some snags. It's not going to be a straight line. But we think that ultimately there are areas that we as investors, and I'm talking about Frost, I'm not saying where we're lending money, I'm saying where we're seeing opportunities to invest money for our clients on a national basis. And one of them is still in logistics. And if you look at logistics, this is a prime community for that. And then take it a little step further. Think about the technology that helps to drive logistics. That's another thing that we're really focused on and that we are very, very interested in. productivity technology. If you can't hire people, you're looking for technology to help to close that gap. And to the degree that we can find companies that can invest in that will improve productivity, we think that that's another theme that has legs. Sustainability. You know, we're in Texas, so I have to be careful about what I say in terms of you know, ESG and all of that. That's not where I'm coming from. Where I'm coming from is that we have a lot of really smart people here in the real estate business. There isn't a commercial real estate entrepreneur in this room that is not worried about how do they take their property and make it more sustainable from an environmental perspective. Cost comes to mind. So we're looking for companies we can invest in, you know, nationally or locally that have this sustainability technology. Healthcare, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for all of us sitting in this room. So pharmaceuticals, the manufacturing, think about the pandemic. It's mind-bending. I mean, this was like a once-in-a-century deal, and it maybe took, you know, what, 6 months before we had a vaccine? I mean, and these technologies are going to be with us for a long time. Healthcare services, we're living this. I mean, I'm talking about San Antonio or your marketplace. Healthcare services is a big area for us. I'm not talking about the bank lending money per se. I'm talking about where we look for, you know, opportunities. The last two areas is affordable housing. And you folks are really keen on that, not just building houses here, but manufacturing the components that go into affordable housing. And the last is the defense industry. I'm not pleased, nor is anybody, about, you know, the global situation that we're in with the war in Ukraine or the Middle East or Asia. But the fact is that this is a center for the defense industry, and that you folks are sitting right, you know, right on the edge or right on the cusp of it. So that's my story.
No, appreciate those comments. You both, thank you. You covered quite a bit. And one thing that struck me that you both mentioned several times, supply chain. We hear it. I tell you personally, I'm fed up with the fact that everywhere I go, they blame supply chain as the issue. I see Tommy Curtis over there from one of our large auto dealerships here talking about the fact they still can't get cars, right? So share with us your perspectives on global, overall supply chain, not necessarily industry vertical. But what do you see a correction anytime in the near future? Alan, you had shared that, you know, you're optimistic given what you've seen, but maybe take us a little bit deeper, and then Lincoln, anything you can add to that before I switch topics on us.
Yeah, and my view is more from the global equity market and from the fixed income market. So the short answer is absolutely yes. There are marketable improvements in the supply chain. Part of it is this phenomenon going from globalization to being local, but we see a tremendous amount of improvement. Is it, you know, all solved yet? No. Automobiles, as an example. I mean, I can't speak for the local dealerships here, but nationally, over the last few days, sales statistics have come up, and they may not be pre-pandemic levels, but they're approaching that level. And why? Because they're able to get chips into the manufacturing process. They're still not, you know, everywhere where they need to go, but it definitely, the supply chain is definitely, you know, easing. And one more thing, this isn't exactly, but it's a corollary. So the supply chain of finance. So Lincoln is, I mean, he's a great banker, and he really knows his stuff. I work for a bank that is highly regarded as having incredibly high credit standards, and we have withstood a lot of turbulence and turmoil. So we see credit standards beginning to tighten. I can also say that we also invest from the investment side in private markets, and so private equity, private debt, and those are huge markets. There's a tremendous amount of dry powder that's yet to be spent. Some measures $2 trillion, some measures $3 trillion. There's a lot of money that's available that's out there with private equity or private debt. The deal is that they're becoming, you know, take FTX and other things that have just kind of blown up. throwing money at new ventures is not going to be the MO. But for people like you that are experienced and seasoned business operators with defined business strategy, there's money that's out there that would look at this marketplace and would invest capital in it.
Lincoln, do you want to add anything? You want me to jump us to a next topic?
Oh, I think I can add a little. I think the quick answer to supply chain is it's improving, but it's still going to be incredibly frustrating just because, Alan talked about, nearshoring and friendshoring and onshoring and all the different sorts of shorings that are out there, I guess. But if you think about the amount of time and investment it took to set up the manufacturing strategies that led to the problem, I mean, it was over decades. And the amount of, it's not going to happen like that. And so I think it's still going to be incredibly frustrating. I would take it from the perspective of, not so much the research and the data, but, just driving to HEB or going to Academy or Bass Pro or whatever it is. I mean, there are still things you cannot get. And I think that's going to be kind of the MO for a while. And to the point about the supply chain of money, I think Alan's absolutely correct. There's definitely different levels or tranches of the market that are available to fund projects, and they're always changing. I think one of the larger sources of funds of projects that has exited the market since the rise in interest rate is for years, since interest rates were so low, one of the biggest competitors to commercial banks for large real estate projects was insurance companies. I mean, we would see people refinancing insurance companies and all that kind of stuff. From what we hear from our customers, a lot of that is starting to dry up because the insurance companies can now go into the bond market and get a better return than what they were getting before without all the risk. And so I think the supply of money is going to shift. It might become more expensive, but that's what I would have to say about that.
No, I appreciate it. I'm gonna switch this gears a little bit and something that correlates back into some of the stuff we were talking about in economic development. Talk to us a little bit and comment on two things that I think go hand in hand. One is the profitability concerns that companies are facing, right? They can only absorb so much given the environment that we're in. What effect is that going to have, given we have so many folks that run businesses here? And couple that with, if you could, the workforce challenges and the new norms that you guys both commented on that exist on the workforce needs and the pressures that are being put on wages, and put the two together, because those two don't go hand in hand to make things work favorably for either. So if you can comment a little bit, Alan, maybe you want to start, and Lincoln jump in.
So, Jason, that's an excellent point. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the time that I spend and my colleagues spend is thinking about the stock market, and that's just a microcosm of private businesses. But one of the biggest concerns in the market at large is what Jason is alluding to, which is margin compression. And that at least, last year, one of the phenomena is, I'm not saying for every one of you, but largely business could take increased prices that they were having to pay for commodities or for labor, and they were able to pass that on to their ultimate, end user, or that intermediary could take it and pass it on to their end user. Well, that's squeezing today, and there's just absolutely no doubt about it that you're going to see margin compression. And, whether it's from what you're purchasing or the appetite that your end client has for taking on that underlying increase in cost. So, if you're looking for capital, that's going to be one of the first questions that a lender or an investor is going to look at. But I would suggest broadly that our expectation is that you're going to see earnings or profitabilities compress whether it's at 5% or 6 or 7%. You know, if you're in a thin margin business, that's a lot. If you're in a fatter margin business, perhaps not so much. But there's just absolutely no doubt about it that margin compression, which is how we refer to it, is here.
Lincoln, maybe take us through a little bit of those comments through the lens of some of the customers you interface with and the industries you work with.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Alan said. I mean, it's business 101, right? If the price of your inputs increase and you don't have the pricing power, you're going to make less money. Probably the simplest equation we'll talk about. And Roberto talked about how small and it's now leaking into the medium businesses are losing that pricing power. And I think for the small and medium business people that we deal with, and I'm one step removed from them because I'm not on the front lines and those sorts of things. But in speaking with our people, I think one of the biggest frustrations is they're battling forces they cannot control. You know, they have no ability to control interest rates. The biggest one that I think I hear about statewide is wages, and I think while y'all have been blessed with so much growth, I hear the biggest horror stories about wages here in this area. I can think of one of our leaders from our Bee Cave location talking about a restaurant there that closed that had been open for 40 years because they couldn't find anybody to wait the tables. And they can make more money in Austin. A food establishment in Fredericksburg offering to pay $40 an hour for somebody to cook a hamburger. Well, gosh, what do you have to charge for the hamburger to pay for that? And so it better be pretty good. But so that's what I hear. And then I think it's some of those unknowns that with the challenge of when you put the business plan together, it was such a vastly different environment that what we're in today. And sometimes time is punitive. I see it in the bond portfolio. I hate opening my bond report because this has been the worst year in bond portfolios ever. And we have a large bond portfolio. But, how do you make changes for decisions you made 5 years ago for your interest rate sometimes doubling? I think one of the things that is the biggest lag increase we see, you talked about it, adding property tax to the tax roll. Well, values of properties lag, and with the increases, that is a substantial increase to cost. And so those sorts of things are where we're seeing the frustration. I think going forward, what it means is, are there doable projects? Absolutely. There's always going to be good business to be done here in this area and Texas in general, but you've got to be more diligent about your planning and understand that your, dire scenarios are more real, because there were times when, we run stress tests at the bank on every sort of loan we do, and one of them is an interest rate stress test. And basically all it is can the borrower afford to make the payment if the rate goes up 200 basis points? Well, since 2008, 200 basis points, come on, that ain't ever gonna happen. Well, now it's, pardon my French, oh crap, they've gone up 450 basis points. So we didn't even think about this. And so I think that's the new normal, is that the extremes are definitely possible.
No, you're segueing great into the next question. I would love you guys to comment on seeing the project activity and the amount we've seen flow into this area in capital. Talk us through a little bit on the capital market lens and the liquidity you see within companies and their ability to continue to invest and grow. We've been blessed with tremendous growth, but what do you see this now impacting our region through the lens of capital markets and the ability for these companies to continue to invest at the levels they have or the rates they have? Alan, you want to start us off there?
Yeah, no, Jason, thank you, and Link, great comments. I would say that it's a bit of a double-edged sword. The first edge is that it's a tougher environment, to be sure, and that your business model just cannot be predicated on low rates or cheap money. It's just that's outdated, and I don't think there's anybody in this room that has a business model that's totally designed around that. On the other side, if I have capital that I want to invest, private equity, private debt, credit, this is a place you want to come to, because you've got, you're between the second and the third fastest growing cities in the United States. You are ideally located from logistics. You've got, I moved here from California almost 4 years ago, so I'm like the poster child for, migration from California to, to Texas. It's like, it's just a better place to be. There's more economic opportunity. So, but all of that having been said, you can't just rely upon the fact that you are in this fabulous area. You've got to run faster, you've got to jump higher, and there's going to be opportunities globally for you folks, but it may not just be served up to you, easily. Some of your competitors may not make it, and that may be a good thing for you folks in terms of, being able to step in and to take advantage of that. Adversity creates opportunities, but you folks are in a great marketplace. So if I'm an investor, I'm going to look for a place that has kind of the best potential outcome, and then get to what Link says. Then you drill down and figure out, are you a good operator, or what's your business thesis? So, that's my
Great.
comments.
Lincoln?
Well, kind of to dovetail on what Alan said, and it's amazing how reasonable you are since you've only been here 4 years. Just kidding. No, I think there's money out there to be invested. I still think banks have the capacity to lend money, but I do think people will be more judicious about where they put their money because of, one, the alternative now looks better than it ever has in recent memory, being the risk-free rates of return through treasuries and those sorts of things in the bond market, which are deemed relatively safe. The other thing is I think that Alan mentioned this before, the banking side of it, credit standards are increasing. While 2008, 2009 was, 13 years ago, that is still fresh in the mind of all bankers, I think. I think we learned a lot of lessons from them from that time. But from the banking perspective, one thing I'm really interested in is where our regulators go with this and how much more punitive they are on decisions we make. We are definitely held to very strict standards on where we can deploy capital and those sorts of things. And so I think those two combined will make funding a little tougher to come by. And we've mentioned it a bunch of times, when supply reduces, what happens to the price of it? It's got to go up. And so I think being judicious on your business models about that is probably the best thing you can do from a liquidity perspective.
No, thank you both for that insight. I think it's helpful, hopefully, for all of our audience members to hear. So take us all the way down the main street now. Take us way down the line here to everybody that's sitting in this room running a business, walking into 2023. Share with them some sage advice that they could take or decisions they should be thinking about to get us through 23 and back to the point of 24 where we start to, from what Roberto had shared, at least some glimmer that will emerge out of the slowdown. Maybe share with them some things they should think about for 2023. And I'll let either one of you decide who wants to jump in first.
Yeah, we'll go back the other way on this one.
Yeah, please.
I think, taking my financial hat off and trying to put somewhat of a strategic hat on, and I actually read this in an article this morning, and it was one of the worst phrases you can use. And I think from 2023 going forward and the lessons we've learned from the pandemic, you've got to take a fresh look at what you're doing. And, well, that's the way we've always done it. Just that ain't going to cut it anymore. And understanding that you've got to take a fresh look at your business model and understand that there's factors that you've never dealt with before, probably in your business, that you have to consider now. You know, Alan and Roberto and I were talking before, and Alan was joking about my age is final, not my age, I'm quoting Alan. I'm the old boy. He said, my age is finally a positive because I'm one of the few people in the room, professionally speaking, that has dealt with an interest rate increase of this magnitude. And I think, you know, that's eye-opening, right? You know, and you've got to step back and say, okay, everything's going to be okay, but I've got to think about things differently because you look at mortgage rates, 7%. Historically, that's not a bad rate, but it's a lot higher than 2.5%, where 15-year mortgages were at before. You know, historically, Wall Street Journal Prime at 7.5%. That's not a bad rate historically, but when it's Fed funds has been 0 and Wall Street is 3.25%, and money is so easy to come by for so long, I think that's what you've got to look after, is just take a step back and realize that, okay, when the pandemic hit, I'm sure every business person in this room went, once we decided and figured out the whole world wasn't coming to an end, you had to take a look at your business model and figure out, how am I going to operate in this new environment, whether it be online sales or my customers not coming here or anymore, those sorts of things. I think you have to do the same thing now because, yeah, we're kind of through it. It's fabulous to be here with not mask on and all that kind of stuff. But consumer behavior's changed, business behavior has changed, and you have to take all those things into account and not just assume everything can just keep operating status quo.
Great. Alan?
Well, so let me build upon what Link's put forth. And so there isn't anybody in the room that doesn't, you know, we lived through the pandemic. I mean, I can tell you, being an old boy, I mean, there's not a lot of times I wake up at dark 30 and go, oh my God, you know, the markets, the pandemic was one of those situations where it was totally outside of anybody's, from a business perspective's, control. And, you know, it wasn't easy, but business people are adaptive, and you changed and you made whatever. You wouldn't be here today if you didn't make those necessary and requisite changes. The same thing with the great financial crisis in 08 and 09. I mean, it was a near-death experience for a lot of, no, I'm serious, for a lot of business owners and banks, and we came through that. And as a result, now, whether it's the pandemic or the great financial crisis, we're in a much better space. So I know I'm repeating myself, which at my age, I guess I like to do. But, you know, all of that having been said, the easy money has been made. And if you can't make money with 0 interest rates, then God help you. And that environment is gone. Does that mean that you can't make money? Absolutely, positively not. But your business model has to be adaptive to prepare for a more higher rates. Inflation is not going to go back down to 2%. I know that, you know, Roberto's a great guy, and I can say this, he's just a great guy, brilliant. But the Fed's got a target rate of 2% on inflation. You know, I don't see it going, I don't see inflation from its current rate going to 2% anytime in the next, you know, year or maybe 2 years. Maybe we'll tickle around that, or maybe the Fed will change what its bogey is. But as business people, you got to adapt and you got to change. I don't see the wage and the employment situation changing markedly in the near term, you know, either. So be adaptive. I don't want to sound corny, but be nimble. And all of this is creating just huge opportunities for businesses that you may not have seen, you know, pre-pandemic, and it's creating them now. And, you know, and I don't want to sound corny, but you're blessed to be in the area that you are in. And so take advantage of it. And you're all successful. You wouldn't be here if you're not. But pay attention to the detail and make sure your business model, to Link's point, is tight, and that, stress test your own business model. Can you afford, if rates go up by what you're borrowing at or what your capital cost is by 4%? So you got to stress test your own, or for investments that you might be making into expansion. This is all, you guys wouldn't be here if you didn't know that, intuitively. But you're just in a great marketplace, and you stand just a great chance for us coming back next year and doing high fives.
Excellent. So we have a few more minutes. I'm gonna add one more that I was just curious, because I look around the room and there's so many public sector folks here and elected leaders for counties, for cities. Anything from that vantage point that you guys would like to share with them? There's a lot of federal spending that's going on that's been approved and will be coming online. Anything that would help them in their decision making and thinking about 23 that you guys would like to add? I know that's a little curveball, but anything that you guys want to jump in and share?
Well, I think you brought up the key point. There's a ton of dough that's out there from the federal government that's still in the pipeline and hasn't even been deployed yet. And that, but you got to make a good base case for it. And, from being a politician, which I'm not, but you have to make a good, base case for it. But you do have a tremendous amount of federal money, and we're blessed in the state of Texas to be in a state that has a very solid overall, financial pinnings. And I'll just give you a sidebar and then flip it to Lincoln. But so Frost, we're not a huge energy lender, but we are is that we are huge in banking farmers and ranchers. And again, through many of the regions that we are banking farmers and ranchers, they are excellent stewards of their land. I mean, forget about ESG. These they live to make sure that they're being responsible and good stewards. But most of them are printing money. Why? Because they also own the mineral rights associated with their property. And this gets indirectly to your point, Jason, is they're printing money, and they're looking for places to invest that. So that's a good thing. But they also are paying taxes on that. So that's going to provide a level of revenues for our local municipalities that they haven't had in a while.
Thank you. Lincoln?
This is really getting out of my wheelhouse going into the public sector, but I'll do my best, even though I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express. I stayed here at the embassy. What I would say, from looking at your projects and those sorts of things, and what Alan said, and understanding from the information we get from our public finance and economic development division guys, is there is a lot of money out there. But I think with what's gone on in the general economy, understanding that focus on the fundamentals is what's really, really important, because the price of your mistakes has become more costly as prices rise and those sorts of things. And I think from an economic growth perspective, and dovetailing it down to what we hear at the commercial banking level and those sorts of things, and this isn't going to be a shocker, but it's infrastructure, and planning and doing things. This is going to be an unsolicited plug. Things like what y'all do and getting communities together and understand that while the world's become more global, all our communities in Texas are all connected now, and getting rid of that Friday night lights mentality. Where I live, it was really bad, and it's still kind of there, right? But understanding that getting together in joint ventures and show that collectively you have the ability to go get the big investment like y'all have demonstrated, I think is you've got to keep going to that direction.
I couldn't have asked for a better way to end. Thank you for scripting that in so many ways. Lincoln, Alan, thank you very much for your time and joining us today. That said, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We're giving you a good 15 minutes back of your day. Thank you so much for coming out, for your support of the organization, for doing what you do in our communities. A reminder real quick as well to fill out that survey if you could for the Federal Reserve. You could drop those at the desk and we'll make sure they get them before you leave. But thank you again for coming out. Have a great day. Have a great 2023, and we will see you soon. Thank you.